Welcome to Techstination. Joining us is Rizwan Virk, founder of Play Labs at MIT and author of The Simulation Hypothesis. Thank you for joining us, Rizwan.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Really some mind-blowing stuff in your book, if you don't mind my saying so, and I'm sure you've heard that before and think so yourself. So tell us what you're talking about when you talk about the simulation hypothesis.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely get that reaction pretty often. And so, the simulation hypothesis, the book is about the idea that we all live inside a computer-generated simulation like a very sophisticated video game, kind of like The Matrix. And there's a lot of different, aspects of that idea. When The Matrix came out 20 years ago, it was considered pretty much science fiction, but a lot of technologists and philosophers and academics and scientists are starting to look at this idea more seriously. So, a few years ago, I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game, and, as I played the game, the reactions were so realistic that for a moment I forgot that I had these goggles on and that I was actually in VR. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the ping pong table, and I leaned against the table just like I might for a real table. Of course, there was no table, and I almost fell over, and the paddle fell to the floor, which was really a controller. And that's when I realized that our technology was getting to that point, what I call the simulation point, where we'll be able to build worlds that are indistinguishable from physical reality. And so part of the book is I trace out the different stages of technology that we would need as a civilization to get to that point.
And you go through a lot about creating video games and the video game industry. You're a creator of Tapfish and other games, so you know what you're talking about here. So tell us how that's all related and how you see this evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first few stages in the road to the simulation point are basically games that we've already created. So if you think of text adventure games back in the day, like Zork and, many others, it was the first time that inside the computer there was a world that could be explored. Now, it was just a textual world, but that was a very powerful idea. And then as we created graphical arcade games like Pac-Man or Space Invaders, you could see some of that laid out in pixels. When I was a kid on the Atari system, I used to play Pole Position, which was a racing game. And I remember always wondering, well, if I'm on the track and there's these kind of fake people in the bleachers, what's beyond that? What kind of a virtual world is out there? And then stage 3 is really the MMORPGs that have been developing over the last 10 to 20 years. Like World of Warcraft, and now we have Fortnite, and of course there are virtual worlds like Second Life and The Sims Online. And, the idea there is now we have millions of players interacting with each other, and we're rendering these worlds in 3D. And so, where we're at today is kind of transitioning from those 2D, I call them 2D, 3D worlds because they're built in 3D, but we still play them on a 2D screen, to virtual reality and augmented reality. And, with the release of Oculus Quest recently, VR has started to have a bit of an upswing there. And so there'll be more and more applications that allow us to get fully immersed in the virtual world, kind of like in that movie Ready Player One, which, you may have seen, where they had the Oasis and people went to school there. They also, socialized through this virtual world. And so, that's kind of where we are today, but soon we'll be developing the technologies where you may not need to have the glasses on to see these virtual objects or these augmented objects. In fact, there's some research into things called light field displays where we can figure out how the light would bounce off of a physical object to different points in the room, and so we can create a hologram that will let the light bounce off of it in that same way. So now the distinction between a physical object and information starts to get blurred. But the real breakthroughs, I think, will come in what we call today brain-computer interfaces. So if you remember in The Matrix, the reason Keanu Reeves' character Neo didn't know he was inside this video game-like world was because he was plugged in, right? He had that wire into the back of his head, and the signals were being beamed. And so, we have many startups today here in Silicon Valley and in Boston and other places that are working on different types of ways to figure out what you're thinking, and also to beam signals into the brain. And, once we do that, if we populate that world with AI that's more sophisticated and can pass the Turing test, we're pretty close to being able to create something like the Matrix. And we get to stage 10, which is downloadable consciousness, which is this idea that we can take our personality and download it into an AI simply by reproducing the patterns of the neurons. And there's, a lot of people like Ray Kurzweil at Google who talk about a technological singularity. But, that's kind of not unlike when we play an avatar in our virtual worlds or video games these days. Once we're able to do that, we would forget that there's actually a part of us that's outside. And so that brings us full circle to the simulation point where we can create this. And so the big question that the book explores and was explored by a philosopher at Oxford named Nick Bostrom was that if any civilization can ever get there, then isn't it possible that some civilization in the universe, though it might be 1,000 years ahead of us, 1,000,000 years ahead of us, has already gotten there? And if so, how many simulations would they create? And the answer is lots, right? It's a technical answer there. Could be billions and billions of simulations because all you need to do is fire up a new server, which have trillions of beings in them. And so, Professor Bostrom made the argument that there will be more simulated beings inside these virtual worlds than there are real biological beings in base reality. And so he coined the term the simulation argument, which says that we are statistically more likely to be inside a simulation than not, if any civilization can ever get there. And in the book, in the first part of the book, I lay out these 10 stages and show that we can get there maybe in another 50 or 100 years. So it's very possible that civilizations have already gotten there.
And you've got quite a few prominent people believing in that this may very well be the case, right? Elon Musk, for one.
Yeah, Elon Musk has talked about it as well. And, it's funny, I talk about ping pong and my kind of conversion experience with virtual reality. And, Elon Musk says, 40 years ago, video games were 2 squares and a dot. And he's talking about Pong, which was the first widely available video game made by Atari, right down the road here in Sunnyvale. I think they were located. And today, we have 3D rendering. Where will it go next? And if you look at 3D printers, 3D printers have already shown us that we basically have the ability to take any physical object and turn it into a series of pixels. Now, most 3D printing today is done with this kind of plastic epoxy, right? So it all kind of has this grayish look. But there have been experiments with printing, different substances, including with human cells. And so now they're printing skin that can be grafted on with actual blood vessels from that person, which bond with them. So it's getting very sophisticated. And so, what I found is that many physicists also, as they look at the nature of the world, the physical world, they look for this thing called matter, and they can't really find it, right? They keep opening up, the big objects, and you see these molecules, and you look inside those, and you see these atoms, and you open that up, and they're mostly 99.9% space, and then you got the neutrons, and you look inside those, and at the bottom level, the only thing they can really find is information, right? So properties of matter. And so, there have been a lot of people who are looking at, well, what does this mean if the world is just information? And so part of the book is really about, why the big mysteries that we have in physics, which a lot of physicists don't like to go into the why of these things because they're kind of confusing, like the observer effect. And, why do these things exist? And it turns out if we live in an information-based world, it makes much more sense because a lot of the techniques that we use in video games, actually parallel some of the findings in quantum physics. And so, for example, there's this idea of superposition, which probably the best way to explain it is not so much to talk about the double slit experiment, which many people have heard of, but Schrodinger's cat, right, which was a cat that after an hour would have 50% chance of being alive and 50% chance of being dead. And common sense tells us the cat is either alive or dead, right? And in a materialist world, that would be the case. There's only one possibility. But quantum physics tells us that both of those possibilities exist. And it's not until somebody observes the cat by opening up the box do we collapse that probability wave into one of those possibilities, which is that the cat is alive or the cat is dead. Well, so it seems like the golden rule at the level of quantum physics is we only render that which is observed. And turns out that's exactly what we use in video games, right? We do a lot of optimization. The reason we can render an entire world like World of Warcraft or Fortnite is because we use optimization techniques. In fact, the history of video games is all about optimization, and it's pushed, computer technology forward ever since like 1950, when Claude Shannon, who was a professor at MIT, made a chess-playing computer. It's probably the world's first practical AI, and a colleague of his, Alan Turing, came up with this idea of the Turing test. And so, in the 80s, if you would have asked somebody, can you make a full 3D rendered world, and they'll say, no, there's not enough computing power to figure out where all those pixels should be. But if you and I are playing a video game and like Call of Duty, and our characters are in the same scene, it turns out there is no shared rendering. You're rendering it on your computer, and I'm rendering it on my computer. And so it's very possible that we're actually seeing slightly different things as well, based on if you're level 2 and I'm level 10, or you're level 30. You might see other things in the scene, and all of that information, all of that is being controlled by information in the cloud somewhere outside the rendered world. And so there are a lot of mysteries in the physical world, too, that don't make a lot of sense unless you adopt this kind of a model of what reality is really like.
So I guess the reaction you would typically get is, oh, okay, so what does this mean? Are there somebody playing a game somewhere, or some kind of being playing a game somewhere, and I'm just part of it?
Yeah, so I think this gets to one of the fundamental issues I try to explore in the book, and actually isn't talked about that much by the academics who talk about this, and that is that there are actually two slightly different versions of the simulation hypothesis, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have both, and that is using video game terminology, since that's the world that I've been in for the past decade or so. I like to say it's the NPC version. NPC stands for non-player characters. So those are the AIs within video games that we might interact with. Or there's the RPG version, which is the role-playing game version, in which case somebody outside the game associates with a specific character inside the game, and that's more like us playing an avatar in a virtual world, for example. And so, if you take the NPC version, then we're all just being simulated on a computer somewhere, and the beings outside are just watching the simulation, like we might watch a weather simulation, right? We want to see what happens. There's this, there's the old example of the butterfly flaps its wings in China, and it affects the stock market in London, which is an example they use a lot in chaos theory, and this idea that if you change initial conditions a little bit, there's great sensitivity, and the outcomes are very unexpected. So there's no way to just have an equation that tells you in one step exactly what's going to happen between the butterfly and the stock exchange, or even with weather, but you have to actually run a simulation. So there's a concept called computational irreducibility, and so if you run the simulation that many steps, you get to see what happens as an outcome. I think that's kind of a depressing view. I like the other view, which is the RPG version, which says that, we are characters inside this game, but there may be a part of us that's outside the game that is in fact playing, and that way we can start to think about our life, and particularly the challenges that come up in our lives as a series of quests and achievements that are put specifically in front of us for us to level up. I mean, sometimes people say to me, well, why would somebody create a simulation? And I say, well, why do we play video games? We play video games so that we can have experiences that we can't necessarily have outside the game, right? I can't necessarily fly on a dragon and battle orcs, right? and be an elf, but I can, inside this virtual reality, and I can have, all kinds of experiences and level up if I'm able to. And that's an interesting model, I think, in looking at the RPG version where we are all player characters. Now, as I said, these two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? In a game like World of Warcraft, I can have actual players and I can have NPCs that I interact with as well, who are there to guide us on our quests, right? And so, I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. I mean, it doesn't have to affect your thinking on life at all. There was one philosophy professor who said, well, we should never try to find out if we're in a simulation, because if we do, the simulators might shut us down, right? And so,
Time for
I
dinner,
say, well, that's
turn the machine off.
Turn the machine off, right? They figured it out, right? But that assumes that we're in the NPC version, and not that it's us who are playing ourselves. So I actually think, that what the simulation hypothesis gives us is a technological way to talk about the nature of reality and what might be going on. And it's something that actually religions have been talking about for a long time. I actually think that most religions, doesn't matter which one, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, they all start when somebody peeks outside the simulation and tries to tell us what's actually out there. And then they bring it into terms, that we can understand here.
You're
inside.
talking about angels, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Eastern religions, you don't even need to draw an analogy. You download consciousness into a physical body, you play the role of that person, and then when the physical body dies, you upload the information back somewhere else, consciousness, and there's a database somewhere that's storing all that information, and then they have what they call karma, which in the book I talk about as a series of quests and achievements and unfulfilled tasks that you have to do. So you go in and play another character, but there's still this information on the cloud, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Angels are always presented to us as beings that live outside the physical world, but that are watching us. And in the Western traditions, you have things called recording angels, who are supposed to be writing down your good deeds and bad deeds. And there's a statue of one in Washington D.C., for example. And so I, as a computer science guy and video game guy, I asked myself, well, how would you do that? You don't need angels sitting there writing down everything that happens. When we play video games, we record and stream those scenes, right? Esports has become a huge industry now. In fact, if you're under 30 years old, you probably enjoy watching, League of Legends finals more than, football, as an example. And so what we do in the video game industry is we actually record those scenes and we play them back. And so, if you look at the religious traditions, and I've actually met people and looked at studies of near-death experiencers, and many of them report a life review where they see in a three-dimensional way everything that happened to them through their entire lives, but they see it from the perspective of the other person. And, so, if you shot somebody, you'd have to see what it was like to be the person who was shot. And so, without judging too much, I look at things from a video game perspective and say, well, how would that be accomplished? Well, we do it all the time. We just record the entire scene, and then we can play it back from any XYZ coordinate. In fact, I was an investor in a company that did that. They would take games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and they would record it because it's a 3D world. They would record it in 3D, and then you could put on a virtual reality headset, and you could basically have a three-dimensional panoramic review of any play in any game anywhere that's been played, and you would feel like you were in it, which sounds a lot like this panoramic or holographic life review that people talk about. And so that's yet another way of looking at things, is that we are actually in a game that is where our moves are being recorded, and it's important to understand perhaps the nature of the game. Right, I don't think we're in Grand Theft Auto, right? For example,
most of us anyway.
Yeah. Some people think they are, right? and they'll get their grades based on that as well. So what I like about simulation hypothesis,
what evidence might there be that this could be, or maybe even probably is, the truth?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's something that is difficult to prove since we're inside the simulation. But as I mentioned, this idea of quantum indeterminacy is one that starts to make much more sense when you look at it through the lens of optimization. When you look at other mysteries in quantum physics, including this thing called the delayed choice experiment, which is saying that, if light photon is going to go through one slit or another, and then it has to make some choices down the road, that choice isn't actually made until somebody observes it. So a good way to think about it is if there's light coming from a distant galaxy and there's a black hole between us and the galaxy, the light might go to the left or to the right. And so you can set up two telescopes to catch the light that went to the left or the right, and that's a random choice. But it's a choice that should have been made, say, 1,000 years ago if it's 1,000 light years away from us, right? Suppose the black hole is. But quantum physics is telling us that choice is not made until the telescopes observes the light. And so, this is just confounding in a material universe. So I think there's more and more evidence that we don't live in a material universe. A material universe would be one where all the pixels are there already rendered all the time, and we move around in those, and that the history is relatively fixed. But what quantum physics is telling us, just like in a video game, there's information about the past, but a lot of that can be changed on the fly when somebody brings it up. And so, there are people who think we shouldn't try to run any experiments to prove this, as I mentioned earlier. There's a physicist named Tom Campbell who used to be at NASA and who's a big proponent of this theory, and he's proposed some experiments that are going on now in a university in Southern California that are trying to show, that you actually need a conscious observer for this delayed choice to take effect, and to kind of show the video game like nature of reality. Anyway, so those are some of the things that I talk about in the book.
So as we go about our daily lives and take everything so seriously, whether it's the debates and the elections or being late for work or et cetera, or the aggravation from our kids, should we be thinking this may not even be real? What am I worried about?
Well, yeah, that's one way to look at it. It's not so much that I wouldn't say this isn't real, but this is a video game that we're a part of, and so maybe we shouldn't take everything so seriously. That doesn't mean that we should take it completely not seriously either, but that each of these things that comes up, may be a part of our story arc inside the game. I mean, sometimes I like to use the analogy of an Indiana Jones film, right? I mean, some people will say, well, if I were to make the video game, I would just make myself a billionaire and I wouldn't have any of these headaches, right? Well, like in an Indiana Jones film, if he got the treasure map right at the beginning with a little axe and said, okay, go get the Ark of the Covenant right then and there's no point for the movie, right? The movie would be over very quickly, and it's not very interesting to watch or to live. And so the difficulties and challenges that we face are kind of an integral part of the story, and maybe that's what the game is about, is how do we deal with each of those. There was another professor at MIT named Max Tegmark, and somebody asked him, if he thought we lived in a simulation, and he said, I'm not sure, but my advice is, just in case we do, whatever you do, make your life interesting, because you don't want the simulators to shut you down if it's not very interesting.
Do you think we're going to find out one of these days?
Yeah, well, I think we will find out that reality isn't what it seems, and that it isn't very physical, and there's a lot of unexplained phenomena that science hasn't been able to explain. And we're going to find out that there's actually information connections that we have not yet discovered. I mean, in many ways, science considers each of us as separate entities, and, the materialist model says particles are separate. But really, there was a physicist named David Bohm, who wrote many quantum physics textbooks, who used to say that it's more like they're like little vortices inside a river. That matter is more like that. So I like to say that we think right now that each of us is a separate computer, like a PC from the 80s that isn't connected, right? But over time, technology develops, and it was inevitable that personal computers got connected because it's more powerful that way. We may find out that we are all connected in some way through information. And so I think eventually we will find some evidence of that. Some people say, well, it's hard to disprove this, therefore, you can't really talk about it intelligently. And my point is that we can find evidence of it, right? We can't necessarily disprove it, but we can find evidence. It's kind of like, a couple hundred years ago, people used to report rocks falling from the sky, and most scientists said, well, of course not. There's no rocks falling from the skies because there are no rocks in the skies, right? The cosmological model that we had was wrong, and that's going to continually be the case, I think, for science to move forward, is the cosmological model we have now is probably also wrong to a certain extent, even though it may be right within, just like they had the right model within the atmosphere of the Earth, but they weren't thinking what was outside of that. And so they said, meteorites don't exist, but eventually people found evidence. In Paris, there was a huge meteor shower. And so the scientists, at least in one university in Paris, were forced to admit it. Eventually, we came up with a better model that says there are these asteroids out there. And I think eventually we'll come out with a better model for our universe, that there's other things out there that make it look very much like a information-based simulated reality.
Well, if you want a read that's going to give you a lot to think about, maybe keep you up at night, the name of the book again is The Simulation Hypothesis. Rizwan Virk, thank you for taking the time with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Now this. How many companies out there have continued to innovate when it comes to building a better radio? I'm Fred Fishkin, host of Techstination, and I'm here to tell you about the new CC Skywave SSB radio from the wonderful people at C. Crane. Bob and his crew really love radio, and it shows in this new compact model that is packed with features. Beyond great AM and FM reception and sound, you can tune into shortwave signals from around the world, listen to ham radio operators, aviation, and more. It's the radio you'll turn to every day, and in emergencies. It will run for nearly 3 days on just 2 AA batteries. Pair the sleep timer with the new Soft Speaker 3, and you've got the perfect radio for your nightstand. Of course, it can wake you up too. Click on C-Crane at Techstination.com and put in the code Techstination for a free flashlight with your order. They love radio, and you'll love C-Crane.